Hello and welcome to Shades of Murder. I am your host, Alita Caldwell. Each week I explore cases of murder and attempt to unfold the layers of darkness that help make humans into monsters. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific and at times very graphic and disturbing details of the case. This show is not intended for all audiences. Listener discretion is strongly advised. This is part 2 of Frozen in a Truck, the Denise Huber story. It would be easy, almost effortless, to label Joseph John Famalaro as evil, an immoral and depraved monster who deserves to suffer and die for his crimes. However, I find it to be lazy and irresponsible as a society if we view violent offenders in this manner. It undercuts the primary purpose and goal of criminology, which is to understand the life experiences of the offender, and thus what may have triggered them to commit such a horrific crime. It is the only way that society even has a chance of preventing such unspeakable violence. This is what is known about the perpetrator who committed the heinous, brutal murder of Denise Huber. Joseph John Famalaro was born on June 10, 1957 in Long Island, New York, the youngest of 3 children. His father was an Air Force veteran who later became a businessman, and he had a traditional, stay-at-home domestic mother. Except his mother was the opposite of subservient or even agreeable. She was known for being very angry and verbally abusive toward her husband. She dominated the entire family. The Famalaro family moved to Santa Ana, California, when Joseph was barely 1 year old. His relationship, along with his siblings, was much more loving and gentle with their father than it ever was with their mother. On top of her being loud and domineering, his mother, Anne, was devoutly religious. She used God and the Bible to justify her often erratic, abusive, and intimidating behavior. Anne told her children when they misbehaved that she needed to save their souls because they were going to hell. Similar to how their father handled his wife, the children obeyed their mother blindly to avoid further abuse. She was notoriously controlling and selected everything from what they wore to what classes they were allowed to take in school. His mother, Anne, also gave them no sense of privacy. She went through their personal belongings and listened in on their phone calls with their friends. Anne was the female version of what we know as a classic abusive controller. She created problems with neighbors being overly dramatic and upset over the smallest of issues. This alienated the family from the rest of the neighborhood. No one ever came to play with the Famalaro children. It was no surprise that they were all regular churchgoers, given how strictly religious his mother was. But they never interacted with any fellow members. People described the children as very disciplined, quiet, and extremely well behaved, noting how they stared straight ahead during the sermon at all times. The home his mother kept inside was the polar opposite of what she presented to the outside world. The family yard was nice, neat, and always tended to, but inside the house was a hoarding nightmare. There were stacks of everything from magazines, food, laundry, both clean and dirty, silverware, newspapers, and boxes. I find it interesting how her son would inherit or emulate these same traits in his personal life. Makes you wonder if hoarding is a personality disorder that someone can genetically pass on, or if it is simply a learned behavior. Apparently, his mother, Anne, was totally paranoid about Russia during this time and was sternly anti-communist. She justified her hoarding so that she and her family could survive the threat of a foreign invasion. It was reported that the defendant did not fare well in his childhood. Joseph was often ill, and he was meek and effeminate. Joseph was small, very thin, and was a little bent over in his stature. His former classmates described him as someone who was pretty much a loner and had few friends. They also mentioned how he never exhibited any streak of violence. Joseph Famalaro did, though, exhibit signs of potential mental illness from early on. His personality was described as going from one extreme to the next. One moment he would be hyperactive, unable to stand still, and his head and neck would twitch. He had obsessive-compulsive tendencies, including rituals that involved symmetry. For example, if someone touched him on the shoulder, he would need the person to also touch the other shoulder so that they were even. It was noted that early on he shared his mother's tendency to hoard, with collections of magazines, books, and papers piled all around his bedroom. He also would fall into bouts of depression. His hyperactivity and what sounds like OCD, ADD, and possibly manic depression all led to Joseph attracting trouble at both school and at home. Any affection or attention to Joseph Famalaro was pretty much sidelined for his older brother Warren. He excelled in everything. He was intelligent, social, and Mom's favorite. His sister Marion attempted to protect her little brother Joseph the best she could. She rode on the bus with him so his classmates would not bully or pick on him, and she helped him to do his homework. Joseph also had his grandmother, who lived with the family sometimes, and with whom he was very close to. His mother, Anne, though, only continued to do more damage to his psyche. She punished her children for any slight misbehavior by beating them with a belt. What is even more damaging was how she personally bathed the boys while they were in their preteens. We all know that this is a critical time of blossoming sexual awareness on biological and emotional changes. So this had to have been very traumatizing and confusing. Joseph's older brother Warren acknowledged how his mother not only bathed him, but that she paid extra special attention to cleaning their genitals. He described how she had told him that it was a special area of his body that needed to be cleaned just the right way. Warren claimed that when his mother did, she behaved differently, and she even breathed heavily. I think it is safe to express that Anne was sexually molesting her own sons under the guise and justification of religion. There is no known information as to what Anne herself may have experienced to be so psychologically disturbed, but the cycle of violence and abuse would continue. Ironically, Anne wanted her children to have nothing to do with sexual activity or have any knowledge of the subject. She refused to allow her children to attend any sexual education classes. They were not permitted to watch any television show or movie that contained anything past the intimacy of holding hands being shown. His mother, Anne, was so obsessed with making sure her boys were not discovering themselves sexually that she even went so far to barge in on them in the middle of the night to ensure they were not masturbating. When they became teenagers, she refused to let any of her kids go out on dates. Warren claimed that when he was in college, his mother secretly followed him to a motel room with his girlfriend Mary. She waited until her son left the motel and then ambushed his girlfriend Mary in the room. Anne slapped the young woman across the face and went on a rant, swearing at her about religion and sex. She even told her that she was going to die that night. When Mary inquired as to how that would happen, Warren's mother, Anne, jumped on her and began to choke her. Mary ran away from this deranged, obsessive mother and immediately called the police. Unfortunately, Warren was still under his mother's perverse control and convinced his girlfriend Mary to not press charges. When Joseph Famalaro turned a teenager, his mother sent him off to a seminary school with the goal that some religion would rub off on him. He then attended a Catholic liberal arts college where he met and dated Ruth W., off and on for a few years. During this period of dating, she had an abortion, and toward the end of their relationship, she got pregnant again. Joseph wanted to marry her, but instead, she gave up his second child for adoption and relocated to Texas. This was a major source of emotional trauma for Joseph. He was more than willing to raise the child on his own, but he lost the custody battle and was not privy to know where the baby was taken. Warren pointed out how Joseph's relationship with Ruth ended not because of his brother, but because of their mother. Even though their mother had done everything she could to isolate and control her children from the world, and beyond meddled in their affairs as young adults, she craved the spotlight. At this same time, Anne became involved in local politics and actively protested against abortion and pornography. She even ran for the city council of Santa Ana, but the same day she announced her running, her eldest son Warren was arrested. It is not shocking that the perverse physical and mental abuse that these boys had suffered at the hands of their mother had done severe damage on their mental health, in particular regarding their views on sexuality and appropriate sexual partners. Warren Famalaro was arrested for child molestation of a 10-year-old girl and a 10-year-old boy, in addition to having sex with a 17-year-old girl. He was convicted and sent to Patton State Hospital as a mentally disordered sex offender. Warren's parents ran away to Prescott, Arizona to escape the humiliation and harm done to their family's reputation. Meanwhile, Joseph Famalaro went to various colleges and at one point was leaning toward becoming a chiropractor, but he never finished his courses. He resided with his grandmother at this time, who, just like himself and his mother Anne, was a hoarder. It was during this period that Joseph rescued the woman from being assaulted by a stranger with a knife, who would testify as a character witness at his trial. The woman was waiting at the bus stop when Joseph saw a man grab a woman and hold a knife to her side. Joseph had some training in martial arts and used his skills to take down the assailant, get the knife away from him, and pin him down to the ground until the police arrived at the scene. Soon after this time, his grandmother would relocate to Prescott, Arizona, to live with his mother. Joseph kept himself very busy, self-employed, cleaning homes, doing maintenance work, painting. He later established a relatively successful house painting business in Laguna Hills, California. Sometimes his business drained him to the point of affecting his health, his appearance, and prevented him from having relationships. As Joseph Famalaro grew older, and likely further away from the manipulation and sickness of his mother, he became more confident and had several girlfriends. The way his former girlfriends described him sounds like he was a classic psychopath, perhaps bipolar, and maybe both. His extreme shifts in mood and energy that he experienced as a child followed him into adulthood. His friends and ex-girlfriends said that Joseph Famalaro was funny, smart, considerate, full of respect, and very polite. But they also said he could be very manipulative and charismatic, and seemed as if he were hiding things. He was known for being very religious, but not sexually repressed as he matured. It was also noted how much of a hoarder he was, and that he was paranoid about his things. And he did not like people around his possessions. There were signs that his mental health was rapidly deteriorating. Only about 1 week before Denise Huber went missing, Joseph John Famalaro was in a very dark place. On May 27, 1991, he reached out to a hotline help center for those who were depressed or have suicidal ideations. It was also commonly known for being a prayer hotline. It was reported that he was on the phone with an operator for 42 minutes that night. His sister Marianne also received a phone call from her brother sometime in June 1991. She said he was in tears on the phone and was very troubled by something that had happened years ago. That next summer, his father was in very poor health and was placed in a hospital. Since he had always had a closer and much more positive relationship with his father than his mother, Joseph decided that it was time to move to Arizona. Joseph Famalaro was on his way home after visiting his ailing father in the hospital with his mother, when he was arrested for kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder. After less than a 2-week trial, a jury would find Joseph John Famalaro guilty of kidnapping and first-degree murder with the aggravating circumstances of sodomy. They recommended the death penalty to the judge, and he was sentenced to death. As previously mentioned, any defendant awarded the death penalty automatically receives the right to appeal their case. This may seem unfair and incite anger in some, but it is a critical right for an individual to have. There have been more cases than society realizes in which a person is given the death sentence and has later been found to be innocent and their conviction overturned. With its historical disproportionate use against people of color and those of lower socioeconomic classes, the right to appeal is essential to uphold our constitutional rights. The appellate case of Joseph John Famalaro involved many claims, but one of the primary reasons stemmed from the fact that the defendant was denied his request for a change of venue. In November 1996, the appellant had requested that the criminal trial be held outside of the county based on prejudicial media coverage. This case rocked the foundation of the very affluent areas of Newport Beach, Laguna Hills, and Costa Mesa, whose privileged residents, some may say even sheltered and naive, had not been exposed to this level of brutality and violence. The community was outraged, and they demanded justice for Denise Huber and her family. Local news reporters not only portrayed Joseph John Famalaro as being guilty before the trial began, but they speculated that he was a sadist, a necrophiliac, and possibly a serial killer. Although Orange County in 1995 was 5th in the highest population in the country, with over 2.5 million residents, it responded to the victim, her family, and the suspected offender as if it were a tiny, close-knit town out for vengeance. Defense expert Edward J. Bronson, Ph.D., professor of public law at California State University, Chico, conducted a survey before Joseph John Famalaro's criminal trial began to show how biased the community was against him. Out of 401 respondents, 83% were aware of the murder, 70% believed that the defendant was guilty or likely guilty, and 72% of the respondents believed that he deserved the death penalty. The defense also submitted 289 editorials and news articles that had covered the story from the time Denise Huber had disappeared to the end of the phase of jury selection. There was also the fact that almost every major television station in Southern California had covered the story, which equated to more than 4 hours long. In response to this request to change venue, the court denied the motion. They claimed that the defense survey didn't distinguish the participants' opinions based on the degree of knowledge they had on the case, nor did it use any test questions to determine the truthfulness of their answers. For a change of venue to be granted at a criminal trial, it must be proven by the defense that it is highly unlikely that a fair and impartial trial can take place within that county. Now, it may seem unreasonable to some, but this is an integral part of our Fifth Amendment right. No one, no matter how damning or seemingly obvious the evidence appears to point to a defendant's guilt, should be denied these rights. This reminds me of the kind of news coverage, including those by some true crime documentaries and podcasts, who labeled Brian Koberger a murderer, a monster who was guilty of slaying 4 college kids in Idaho before his trial even began. I personally don't believe it should be allowed because it is biased, unfair, and unethical to call someone guilty who is innocent under the law until proven guilty. I am sure many would disagree with me on this, but place yourself in the shoes of the defendant and their loved ones. What if there was a possibility that the person is innocent? Or even if they are guilty, the circumstances are much more complicated than initially realized. This kind of sensationalist biased coverage can eliminate the possibility of receiving a fair trial, and that should not be permitted. It can also paint the picture that the defendant is being unfairly bullied by the press, which may increase empathy for them instead. This could lead some jurors not knowing if they can trust the prosecution's case, and this could lead to a mistrial and therefore a lack of justice. Now, don't get me wrong in my intentions of expressing its importance. The evidence against Joseph John Famalaro was outrageous and went far beyond any usual circumstantial evidence. But as a citizen of this country, his rights must be upheld, because if they aren't, then all of our Fifth Amendment rights are threatened, and no one wants that. The defendant's later petition for review would also be denied. There were also several other claims the appellant raised in the court. I won't bore you with all of them, but the one I found most interesting and the most relevant to both the offender and the victim was the trial court's refusal to admit any mitigating circumstances. These are circumstances in a court of law which may minimize the degree of mens rea, or the criminal intent. They are not circumstances which excuse the crime, but they may help to better understand the state of mind of the offender. During the penalty phase, the defendant's sister Marion was questioned by the defense regarding the emotional conversation she had with her brother the same month Denise Huber disappeared. When the defense asked Marion if Joseph had ever mentioned to her being sexually molested by his older brother Warren, the prosecution objected on the grounds of hearsay, which the court upheld. Once away from the jury, the defense counsel asked Marion if she would testify that during this phone call with her brother, he had admitted for the first time to her about the molestation. The defense asked for this evidence to be admitted as non-hearsay because it established the state of mind the defendant had after he killed Denise Huber. Instead of being this thrill killer, which the prosecutor painted him as, someone who enjoyed inflicting pain and torture on a young woman, the call between brother and sister indicated that the defendant had a level of conscience as to what he had done and was beginning to understand the trauma that may have triggered his violence. The state wanted the jury to believe that the defendant had kept her body in the freezer and all of her belongings as trophies, which was a logical assumption to make. However, this intimate and emotional call between brother and sister showed that Joseph John Famalaro was deeply affected by what he did, and he had concealed everything to avoid apprehension, and maybe nothing more. I admit that this is difficult to believe considering how long he held onto her body and how he had kept her personal belongings in little boxes. Nevertheless, this conversation was critical to his defense to demonstrate his motivation and mindset before and after, and I find it pretty shocking that the court did not admit it as evidence. However, when his brother Warren took the stand for the defense, he denied ever molesting his little brother Joseph. His word is difficult to believe since he was a convicted child sex offender, but only the brothers know the truth. It can't be denied that his upbringing and all of his siblings were twisted. Nothing can ever condone or excuse the atrocious crimes committed by Joseph John Famalaro, but it is critical to know these aspects of a violent offender's life. It could be the difference between receiving the death penalty and life imprisonment. Once incarcerated, it could be the difference between the defendant receiving the extensive therapy, psychiatric care, and medication that he needed all of these years ago. Joseph John Famalaro still awaits his punishment at California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation in San Quentin. He will likely die on death row since California has had a moratorium, which is a pause on the death penalty since 2006. This is due to the absence of what the state, in addition to many others, deems to be a humane way to die by the current option of the 3-chemical injection. I would also like to address the victim in this case because it is important to understand some of the elements that may have helped to manifest this crime. Victimology is the study of the relationship between victims of crime and their offenders. It is a branch of criminology that seeks to understand how specific characteristics and elements of an individual's environment or lifestyle may increase the likelihood of their becoming a victim. One of the most popular theories of victimology was developed by criminologist Cohen and Felsen, who believed that the routine activities, which is related to crime opportunity theory, should be utilized to study crime trends and victimization. It looks at how the convergence of time, place, a motivated offender or offenders, a suitable target or victims, and the absence of a capable guardian can result in a crime being committed. This theory states that crime is dependent upon the interaction of a criminal who is motivated to commit an offense, someone who is vulnerable to becoming a victim, and the presence or the absence of someone or something that helps to prevent or facilitate the crime. During his criminal trial, the defense pointed out that Denise Huber's blood alcohol level was somewhere between 0.08 and 0.11 at the time of her disappearance. I would like to mention that to reach that level, one has to drink excessively. Before researching this topic a few years ago, I thought that the legal blood alcohol level was pretty modest and wouldn't equate to that many drinks. Now, of course, the amount someone drinks per hour to reach this level depends on various factors, including gender, weight, height, and how much time passes between drinks. For example, a man weighing 170 pounds will reach 0.08 blood alcohol level if he is consuming 4 drinks in an hour on an empty stomach. Now, a woman only weighing 137 pounds can only drink 3 on an empty stomach before reaching this level. That is approximately my own weight, and if I drank 3 alcoholic beverages, specifically cocktails of any kind, on an empty stomach within an hour, I would be excessively wasted and violently ill. I only address this matter because this young woman was driving extremely intoxicated on her own in the middle of the night. She had trouble with her vehicle, which forced her to pull over on the shoulder of the road. She was likely disoriented and dizzy, which made her highly unlikely to call the police and even less likely that she would have taken the chance of stumbling down a 64-foot embankment in her high heels to seek help. Being so intoxicated likely lowered her defenses and made her more likely to trust a stranger. Remember that this was a time before mobile phones. Yes, there was the call box, but Denise Huber would have been looking at a DUI on her record, which could have potentially derailed her future plans. These circumstances combined greatly increased the chances that she would have been happy to accept a ride from a seemingly friendly man in the middle of the night rather than remain stranded on the side of the road. Please, let me stress and understand that this is not victim blaming, but this is an example of classic victimology. One of the most basic yet applicable criminal theories aforementioned, routine activities theory, involves a motivated offender, a vulnerable target, and circumstances, in particular environmental ones, which can create the perfect scenario for a crime to occur. Denise Huber was very dressed up for her night out. She was stranded on the side of the road in the middle of the night, intoxicated and unable to defend herself, making herself a prime target for a predator. Again, let me stress, this is not victim blaming, but it is critical to understand why one person may have been selected over another to be his victim. To understand violent crimes, the offenders and their victims must be studied and analyzed to help prevent people from becoming future victims. There will always be predators out there waiting for a victim to appear at the perfect moment when no one is around and there are no cameras or any viable way for the victim to reach for help. It is up to us as individuals, but even more so as women, to take care of ourselves and not be placed in circumstances that can make us targets. It is disgusting that this is the way it is. We can try to deny it all we want and hope that time brings significant changes, but I'm not holding my breath. Violent crime has always existed and always will, especially sexually motivated crimes against women. And we want to make it as difficult as possible for offenders to fulfill their sick desires. Victimology also involves the psychological impact made upon the victim and their loved ones. I can't even imagine how incredibly painful it would be to lose your loved one in such a tragic and horrifying way. Especially a child, a young woman whose entire life was ahead of them. It was shared during the victim impact statement phase of the criminal trial how Denise Huber's parents, Ione and Dennis, were destroyed by their daughter's disappearance. The endless spiral of emotion they endured during the 3 years she was missing, without any idea as to what had happened, was unbearable. To me, that is the definition of purgatory. Having to wonder and wait and attempt to lead some semblance of a life, never knowing what happened. Once their daughter's body was discovered, especially given the morbid and grotesque circumstances, the grief and pain Denise Huber's parents must have experienced knew no words. Her mother, Ione, spoke of how much she missed having her daughter to do things with. She and Denise frequently went out on mother-daughter lunch dates. They enjoyed hanging out by the pool or going to the beach and cooking meals together. Ione Huber described her daughter as sensitive, caring, and compassionate, who brought her life the greatest of happiness. When her daughter Denise disappeared, Ione's health was severely impacted. She endured several surgeries, including one for cancer. Her father Dennis's health was also severely impacted by the loss of his daughter. He lived with a continuous feeling of sickness that just never went away. The Hubers attempted to enjoy life and went on a trip to Palm Springs together once. But upon their arrival, they heard news that a body was discovered in the desert. They immediately packed up and left, returned home to only find that the body was not Denise's. Her father also had planned on starting his own business, and the day it was supposed to be opened, his daughter disappeared, which ruined any prospect of it ever opening. Dennis Huber shared how much he missed the simple things he and his daughter Denise shared, like the breakfast they had together every Friday morning. Denise had that special way about her, and she could cheer up her dad with her silliness and her great big smile, no matter how he was feeling that day. He shared with the court how only a few days before Denise left his world for good, she had left him a note on his computer screen, typed with a happy face, and said, "Hi, Dad. I love you. Have a great day. Love, Denise." Dennis Huber was never the same in spirit or body after he lost his daughter, and he suffered from constant health issues. Telling these stories of innocent lives ripped away by such violence is not just a way to pass the time. Sharing the disturbing lives and actions of the perpetrator is not just a morbid fascination into humanity's darkest parts. No experience in life, no matter how tragic, abusive, or disturbing, can condone committing such violence against another person. There were so many warning signs in the life of Joseph John Famalaro, and I can't help but believe that if someone had spoken up, especially his father, and tried to help him and his siblings when they were young, maybe both himself and his brother Warren's horrendous crimes against the innocent could have been prevented. It is not about placing blame or empathizing with the offender, but it is about knowledge and prevention and the responsibility we all have as human beings to speak up when something does not seem right, especially with a child. As a podcaster of the true crime genre, I feel responsible for sharing this knowledge and having a voice in its prevention. That ends part 2 of Frozen in a Truck, the Denise Huber story. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I am beyond thrilled to be your host. Until next time, stay safe and watch out for shades of murder happening in the streets, next door, especially inside your own home. Shades of Murder is created, researched, written, and edited by Alita Caldwell. Original song Stranger, composed by Stereocode.